Welcome, everybody. See the attendee number is just ticking up, so we'll give it a minute or so before we get started. But thank you for joining so far. Okay, it looks like the number of attendees has sort of stabilized a little bit. So we'll get started with some introductions and some housekeeping, and everyone else that joins can just catch up, hopefully. So welcome, in fact, today to this CoffeeTime QI webinar, one of a series of webinars that we're running. Today is all about an introduction to improvement charts. Just going to kick off with some housekeeping before we get going. So first of all, introductions. Hi there, my name is Jason Williams, part of the Life QI team here, and I've been involved in improvement charts and working with healthcare organizations on both of those for probably best part of 10 years now. So I've picked up some tips along the way that I'm hoping to share with you today, and I'll be leading the session in that manner, and then joined by my colleague Sophie, who's also here with me, and she will be managing kind of the chat and the Q&A, and trying to post as many useful links to resources as possible during the session. So do keep an eye on the webinar chat. She'll be posting some links in there. And speaking of which, do feel free to say hi in the chat. Looks like people are already doing so. Good to understand kind of who you are, which organizations you're representing. That's always good for us to know. And if you've got any questions as we go through today's session, please ideally post them in the Q&A if you can find that, because that makes it a bit easier for Sophie to kind of triage them. But otherwise, feel free to post them into the chat, and Sophie will do her best to kind of pick them up from there. And we'll pause regularly to try and take some questions. What else? If this is one of your first times on a Zoom webinar, it's different to the meeting format. We can't see you, we can't hear you. I'm afraid you'll only be looking at and hearing from me and possibly Sophie. So do use the chat, do use the Q&A to interact as much as you wish to do so. And finally, the session's been recorded. So you will get an email that comes out in 24 hours time with a link to the recording. So if you need to dip off early or you want to share it with some colleagues, feel free to do so. Okay, let's move into kind of the agenda. And first of all, as I mentioned before, this is part of a series of webinars. We've started this CoffeeTime QI series fairly recently. And in fact, today's session is one of 3 all around measurement and charting, basically. We ran one last month on measurement for improvement, which is available on YouTube. We'll share the link to that a little bit later, so you can watch back kind of the basic introduction to measurement for improvement there. Today's is sort of the middle session, introduction to improvement charts, and we'll go through that agenda on the left-hand side in a moment. But then looking ahead to next month, we've got 12th of June, we've got the one at the bottom right-hand corner there, interpreting SPC charts. So we will touch on some of that today. We'll get into looking at some charts and some of the elements within a chart. But the next session will dive a bit deeper in terms of, once you've got that chart, how do we evaluate it? What is it telling us? How do we make decisions based on that chart? So we'll share the link to the webinar page to register for that one as well a bit later. But yeah, certainly if you find this one helpful, certainly recommend booking on to next month's one as well. Okay, as you can see, we've got the agenda on the left-hand side there. Got a few slides we're going to work through to cover those topics, and then we're actually going to jump into Life QI itself, the software, and work through creating a chart. But let's dive into the first topic for today: run charts versus control charts. First of all, I'm going to use the term control charts and SPC charts kind of interchangeably. So kind of the similar terminology for the same thing. But distinct from that, we're going to talk about run charts, kind of run charts or control charts, basically. And very much the idea of this session is those that aren't particularly familiar with this kind of terminology or haven't really used them, we're going to try and lay out some of the differences, some of the benefits, how you might go about choosing the right one. The things that are kind of the same about these two types of charts is they're both about recording data over time, and then looking at the variation in that data and help you understand whether the variation is normal or there is something going on that is statistically significant in terms of that variation. So the run chart is kind of essentially the more basic version. Provides a basic understanding of trends and shifts over time, and it does. There are certain rules that get applied to these charts that will help you identify when the variation is what we would call special variation or statistically significant variation. In terms of some of the differences, the first one we've got there in terms of the bullet points is the center line. So we look at the examples we've got here. The pink line is the data that we're recording over time. And the green line we've got kind of horizontally is what's called the center line. On a run chart, that's a median. So the average value sat across the middle here is a median, whereas on a control chart, it's calculated as a mean. Might seem like a subtle difference, but the difference there is a mean will be far more sensitive essentially to the data that you add. Each time you add a data point, there is a greater chance that the average value for your system process is going to move up or down, whereas a median is less sensitive. It's only really looking at the highest and the lowest value and plotting the midpoint between them. So the run chart, essentially you don't need as many data points to be able to create that median, and it's not going to jump around as much every time you add a data point. Whereas the control chart, is more sensitive to the data that you're adding, and in some ways you'll get a different sort of average or potentially a more accurate average. So it seems like kind of a subtle difference, but it's quite important to understand. The next point here about run charts is they can detect some types of special cause variation, whereas on a control chart, it can detect more types of special cause variation, essentially. The reason for that being the run chart, you've only got this center line. You don't have any upper and lower control limits, whereas on the control chart example, you see we've got these kind of red lines at the top and the bottom. They're kind of setting upper and lower sort of bounds or thresholds within which we expect to see the system perform. So it can use those boundaries essentially to detect whether certain types of variation are happening. I.e., do you go outside of those bounds, or is there certain types of variation within those boundaries? A control chart is able to detect different types of special cause variation because of that. So it's again a bit more sensitive to the data in that sense in terms of the type of variation it can detect. And as I said, these charts are all about trying to detect special cause variation. So that's not the normal level of variation you'd expect in a process, but things that are statistically significant, what's potentially something that's causing the system to perform abnormally, basically. And that's often what you're looking for, whether that's in a good way or in a bad way. You're looking for variation that's statistically significant. And in order to do so, you obviously need a bunch of data over time. So one of the key differences that we've already alluded to is the amount of data. So a run chart, you essentially need less data plotted across that chart before you can calculate a center line, before you can set the baseline and begin to kind of test or begin to detect special cause variation. Whereas with a control chart, really you want more than 15 data points before you can realistically kind of accurately say, right, this original kind of average center line that we've got is a representative baseline, and we can now move forward and we can now accurately detect special cause variation baseline. So in some sense, if you're not going to have very much data, if you've only got a year's worth of data and you can only collect once a month, 12 data points, then a control chart might not be as appropriate. You might need to use a run chart just because you can get going with fewer data points. But there's obviously the downside that the run chart is less sensitive, it's less accurate in some sense to detecting different types of special cause variation. Perhaps a benefit of using run charts, the last point we got there, is it doesn't require a choice between different chart types. It's just a run chart. There's no picking different types of run chart. It's just a run chart. So it's a bit more straightforward to get started. There's less decision making involved in that sense. So that can be seen as a benefit. Kind of on the flip side, with control charts, there are choices. There are a range of different control charts to pick from, and you pick based on the type of data you've got. So that can make things a bit more complicated in terms of people are a bit unsure how to choose the right chart type, which is something we'll talk about in a minute. But it does mean that if you can make an appropriate decision, then you'll be able to plot your data on a chart that is most appropriate for the data that you've got, and it will do a better job of detecting more of the special cause variation in the process. So ideally, you should be using a control chart if you can, because it will inform sort of better kind of decision making. And that's the next slide, sorry. The kind of the key benefits, what they kind of result in terms of SPC charts, is we talked about it being more sensitive, it's essentially more comprehensive, there are more chart types, it detects more types of special cause variation, and what that really leads you to is more informed decision making, because the whole point of, again, of these charts is you're trying to detect, where have I got special cause variation, where is this process not performing as we would expect it to. So the control chart does a better job essentially of detecting that. So if you can do that, you've got more likelihood that you'll be making more informed decisions around spotting things sooner that a run chart might not spot, and therefore able to make decisions about continuing or starting or stopping the various initiatives or changes that you've made that are trying to cause some variation in the process. Going to pause for a second there before we move on to the next topic, just to throw it over to you, Sophie. Have we got any questions that have come in so far? I'm conscious that quite a lot of material covered already.
No, absolutely. Yes, there is a very good question that's just come in actually that I was just about to reply to, but I will let you answer it. So someone's come in saying, if I needed to measure different outcomes such as waiting times and number of assessments completed, does Life QI allow me to create more than one chart for each outcome I need to measure?
Yes, it does, is the short answer to that. We'll go through in a second the different sort of chart types and how you would pick different chart types for those different measures. And then when we get onto the kind of the demonstration bit, you'll be shown kind of that you can create as many measures as you require, basically as many charts as you require. Cool.
Great,
Good
that's all
question
for
early
now.
on. Thank you. So yeah, there are benefits to both chart types. And as I said, depending on how much data you've got, the sort of data that you've got, it might be appropriate that a run chart is most suitable. But ideally speaking, be looked at creating a control chart or an SPC chart if possible. The often difficulty or apprehension that comes with that is there are a range of different control charts, and people are like, I don't really know how to decide what's best for me. And on the face of it, this slide isn't really going to help with that because it looks pretty busy, pretty confusing. We're going to go through the decision tree in a bit more detail in a minute. I'll bring up a bigger version, but essentially there are the best way of doing this is there are some questions to answer that will help you arrive at the most appropriate type of SPC chart. And I've also got examples of the charts scattered around the outside. The other way that I find quite helpful is you use examples like this where, so an eye chart, for example, if you're measuring something to do with someone's weight or their blood pressure or something to do with money, the cost of something, there's a good chance it's going to be an eye chart. If it's percentages of things, then there's a good chance it's going to be a P chart. It might not just be a P chart, but things like that. If it's days between falls, days between something, days between infection outbreaks, there's a good chance it's going to be a T chart. So we've got examples like this here on this slide and within Life QI itself that help you think, oh yeah, I'm measuring something like that, then that's probably the right chart type for me. But what we're going to do now is I'll bring up a bigger version of this decision tree and try and walk you through the kind of questions that you want to ask yourself in order to arrive at the right chart type, basically. And we've got this in what we call this SPC cheat sheet. And we can share a link to our website where you can download this. It's kind of a 4-page PDF that talks about the difference between run charts and control charts. It's got this decision tree. It breaks down some definitions. It's got those examples of the different chart types in it. So this is a really useful resource. And the idea is, as a cheat sheet, it's something you would download or print off and have available that you can kind of look at every time you need to look at it, basically. If I zoom in to the decision tree part of the paper, I'm going to try and walk through each of the kind of the branches now and explain how you might end up at the bottom of each of these in terms of, because what you're looking to do is end up on one of these pink boxes because these are the different names of the chart types. We're only going to spend a couple of minutes going through this. So yeah, you're probably not going to have taken all of this in first time round, but the idea is hopefully it demonstrates it's relatively easy to answer these questions. And certainly if you download this and have it as a resource available, you should be able to do it next time you've got a real measurement, a real measure in front of you, basically. So first key question, what type of data are you collecting? Generally segmented into discrete or continuous, or more helpful way of kind of answering that is this something that you're counting or something that you're measuring? You measure the weight of something, you measure the height of something, things like that, but you count the number of patients that attended the clinic today or something like that. So that's, are we counting things or are we measuring things? Normally fairly easy to answer, and that will lead you down one of two halves, basically. We start off on the right-hand side. We are measuring something. Then are you combining observations from multiple sample groups? Sounds a little bit complicated, but in reality, how many? So an example here would be if we're running a clinic. Every day we run a clinic, and a certain number of people attend that clinic every day. If it's only one clinic a day, that's one sample group. There's only one population of people there that we are measuring any data with. So not multiple sample groups. It would be an eye chart. But if we run multiple clinics, maybe we've got different hospitals, we run 5 clinics across 5 hospitals, then essentially I've got 5 sample groups. So in which case, the answer is yes to that question, and we'd end up with an XBAR-S chart because it's something that we're measuring, and we're measuring it from multiple sample groups, basically. So that's fairly straightforward. In reality, if you're coming down this route, we don't see that many XBAR-S charts. They are a little bit more complicated. Most people aren't measuring something across multiple sample groups. It tends to be one sample group at a time. So you're more likely to end up at an eye chart if you're coming down this route. Probably that said, I think most of the measures we probably see are down the counted route. So something that we're counting. Often it's things like, the number of patients with a particular condition or the number of patients that didn't attend a clinic or whatever it might be. So we kind of end up down this sort of route. The question that you then ask, are you measuring a rare event? And there are some definitions of what classes as a rare event. Good example in the kind of the hospital environment would be, is this a never event? That's certainly going to be what you'd hope to be a rare event. So yeah, if it is a rare event, yes. And then we're going to come down this avenue. How are you measuring the space between these rare events? Again, if it's never events, are we interested in recording the amount of time between never events? Often, the number of days between a never event. Then it's going to be a T chart. Nice and easy to remember because T charts often do with time between something happening. But if we're not measuring it based on time, if we're measuring it based on the number of normal events that happen between these rare events, then you can end up with a G chart. We probably see more T charts than G charts, but again, you might end up with either. And again, that being said, not that many measures that we see are kind of the rare events. Most people will often end up down this far left-hand column. So this is something that we're counting, but it's not a rare event. So the next question then is, are these observations binomial? Essentially, the answer is yes or no. It's a pass or a fail. The answer is one thing or the other, basically. About as simple as that. So yeah, if it's things like how many patients have got a particular condition, the example we'll look at in a minute to do with pressure ulcers, they've either got pressure ulcers or they haven't got pressure ulcers. So that's kind of a yes, no. So yes, if it's something you're answering in that respect, then it's probably a P chart, P for percentage chart. So that's going to be measure things like the percentage of patients that have got pressure ulcers or the percentage of patients that didn't attend their appointment, things like that. You'd end up with a P chart. But if it's not this kind of yes, no, pass, fail, then you've got one more question to ask, which is the sample size constant? Again, if I go back to the clinic example, if we run a clinic every day, if we always see 20 patients at that clinic, then yes, the sample size is constant. It's always 20. It's always going to be out of 20. But if the number of patients we see, the number of clinical appointments we have varies because there are lots of different types of appointment, then the sample size each day could be 5, it could be 20, it could be 25 the next day. So in which case it's a no, and we'd end up with a U chart. So spend a bit of time going through that. Appreciate you probably want to go through that in slower time if you are really deciding how you're going to measure something, which is why I recommend downloading this resource, and you can kind of work through that in slightly slower time. See, Sophie's popped up again, so it's a good point for a quick question break if there are any before we dive into live QI.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, a good question just come in. So when you talk about constant sample sizes, so an example that's come in, so if you're measuring the number of assessments completed by 4 clinicians as opposed to a changing number. So for example, 4, but then they drop to 2 due to sickness.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand. So if you like the sample size, the number of assessments completed.
So yes, you've got a number of assessments are completed by a certain number of clinicians, but then you've got the changing sample size of there's only 4 instead of 2, if that makes sense. If not, I can ask for a little bit more detail in the chat box.
Then that's, yeah, the number of people doing the diagnosis does change, but I don't know whether that really counts as the sample size in that.
Oh, thank
It's
you.
worth on
They've just come back and say number of assessments completed, but the clinician number keeps
5,
changing
4.
due to sickness or study leave
Okay.
or maternity leave, etc.
Okay, then I guess, yeah, no, the sample size is variable there. I think that would make most sense. No, so yeah, you'd end up with a U chart, I would have thought.
Perfect.
Cool,
Thank
hopefully that
you.
makes sense to that. Okay, we are going to keep going because we've got a few different things to touch on. I'm going to show you this bit very quickly because we've got less than 10 minutes left, and then we'll dive into the demonstration. So this is a bit of a view of what a chart looks like, particularly one of the control charts within Live QI, and try to just label the different elements so that we can kind of understand what we're looking at. I'm gonna maybe skip through some of this fairly quickly so we can actually get a bit more time on the demonstration. But you'll see that the thicker black line is the data line. So it's number kind of 4 down here, thing that you're entering the data for. We've then got all of these other horizontal lines. You've got the center line, upper and lower control limits, and these other horizontal lines, which you'll see on some control charts, are the other parts of control limits. Basically, they're the inner sigma, which not every software displays, but we do because it helps you detect some of that special cause variation. The pink elements at the top here are where it has detected special cause variation, whether that's high variation, low variation. It could be a trend, it could be a shift, all sorts of things, but they are highlighted for you at the top of the chart. We've got some annotations where you've added notes or you've linked in PDSA cycles, things like that. Yeah, they're kind of the main points. I'm not going to dwell on that too much longer because I'm conscious of time and we want to get into Live QI now and actually have a look at creating a chart. This is done in a project. So if you've already got a project, you'll probably see it on your start page, or you can go into the projects area itself and create a project. And then once you get into that, I'm just going to click into one I've already got for the purpose of today. Once you've set up a project, you'll have a number of different pages. It's on the measures and charts page that you want to create and update your measures and your charts. Appreciate I've skipped through all of that if you're new to Live QI, but we have a starting a project in Live QI webinar a bit later this month that we'll advertise shortly. So that will walk you through that process in a lot more detail. But let's say you've got here, I've already got a whole series of measures already set up on this project, but if I'm going to create a new one, got this gray new button over here, I'm going to click on that and I'm going to go through a kind of a 3-step process to define my measure, and then we get to add some data and create the chart. So a couple of mandatory fields highlighted in red here. So I've got to give it a title. Just going to call it webinar measure for today. And then I have to pick the type of measure. So we've already had, I think, someone mentioning outcome measures. We've got outcome, process, or balance measures. They're the 3 different types you can select, which we haven't explained today. But any of these fields where you're not quite sure how you might answer it, there's these little information kind of icons here. If I click on that, it will give me an explanation, basically a definition of outcome measures, process measures, and balance measures to help you decide. Generally speaking, most of them are going to be process measures, 1 or 2 outcome, and you may have some balance measures. Let's just make this one an outcome. Then got free text field, which is totally optional, but this is where I'd write my operational definition. So really defining what it is that we're going to measure, particularly helpful if you've got other people that are going to help with that measurement. You can fill in that here. I'm going to skip over this just to save time. Then data collection plan, again, helpful if you've got other people that are collecting the data, and a bit of guidance here. So how will the data be collected? What data sources are you using? How often? Who's responsible for collecting that data? The more detail you can provide there, the more likely it is to stick to plan, as it were. So again, free text, just describe how you're going to go about collecting that. And then we get into picking the different chart types, and you see the little downward arrow shows this is a drop-down field. So if I click into that, I'll get the list of these. We've briefly run through the decision tree, so you may have a decent idea now of which of these you would pick. If you're happy, you just pick straight from the list. Or we've got this little prompt under here, need help choosing a chart type. And if I click on that, I get this extra pop-up, which has got the list across the top here. And I can kind of flick through each of the chart types, and it will give me a decent explanation as to what a C chart is all about, why you might use it, typical examples of what you might use it for, and then it details the data that I will need to capture. So these are almost like your column headings for your data sheet. So time and count for that one. If I picked a P chart, for example, see it's all about percentage, and I'm going to have the dates, and I'm also going to have the count and the sample size. So let's just keep it a bit simpler for today. Run chart. Yeah, I'm going to have a label and I'm going to have a value. So let's go pick that. So I've picked my chart type. I can then click data collection frequency. So we have a number of regular frequencies that you can pick from. So if you know you're going to be collecting every month or every week, whatever it might be, pick one of these because it will help auto-populate the dates, and it will help you aggregate the data if you're measuring the same thing in multiple locations. But if it's going to be a bit more sporadic than that or unknown, then you can pick custom unknown, or if it's not even dates, particularly if it's one of the T charts or something, they're not dates, there might be days between, then you would pick a no date chart. Let's pick daily for this example. So I've clicked that and just make sure I don't click out of this box. I'm going to continue to work through this 3-step box here. Last option is if I want to link my measure to any of the drivers on my driver diagram. So I can kind of look up parts of my driver diagram and make that linkage if I wish to do so. Totally optional, but it can be useful. It will show up then on the driver diagram. Just make that link. So that's completed that. Click create measure. That's essentially defined what it is I'm going to measure. That's going to take a second to save. That's saved now. And I'm now the second phase is I actually go and add the data to the chart. So no charts yet, but I've defined the measure. You can see it's an outcome measure. I can see it's a run chart. The plan information that I've just defined is in this tab. I need to make some changes there. Back on the charts tab, I can now walk through adding a chart and adding some data. This is that kind of separated the creating the measure from the chart, because quite often you might have multiple charts. If you're recording the same thing in different locations, you need a chart per location, so it allows you to create that. And because of that, you can give each one a name. I'm just going to call this one chart 1, but it might be if you're recording on a particular clinic, it might be, you know, clinic 1, for example. So you can separate it from clinic 2's data. Beginnings of my data sheet here, I'm going to add a first few rows. So I just click add row, it'll add those rows in, and then the first thing I can do is just start to type the data in, or I could paste that data in. If I just add a few blank rows to get going, and pick some dates. Because I've picked daily data, it's pulled me up with a calendar, and I can just kind of pick those dates and quickly type in some values. First few data points, click create chart, and it's going to be happy to set that up for me. So still on this page, I can add another chart, or I can now click onto this and it'll open up that chart for me. I can now see my run chart. It's plotted that data for me. It's plotted the center line for me. I've got the data beneath here that I've just entered, which I can come and delete those data points, so I can make changes to those data points. And essentially, it's kind of as easy as that. Couple of steps to get that measure defined, and then nice and easy to add data or continue to update the data. That was a very quick kind of run through of creating a chart. I'm conscious of the amount of time we've got left. So I'm going to roll back to the slides. Sophie, you've popped up again. Any questions? Anything I've missed so
Sorry.
far?
I know we are running short on time, but we have had a request in the chat. If you could just quickly show how to set the baseline on a chart, if that's okay.
Okay. We can do it in here. So now that I've created my chart, I don't have many data points. I'd certainly recommend having more, and it may well give me a warning because of that. But I clicked edit on top of the chart here, and that now allows me to edit both the chart and the data down here. We are automatically in the baseline phase. That's where every chart's going to start. But if I kind of want to fix that baseline and now move forward into the next phase, if I click on the data point at which I want to make that break, essentially, then I've got options. Add a note, link a PDSA, or in this case, I can move to the next phase. So I'm going to click that. And it is giving me a warning that I don't really have very many data points. Really, you should have far more, over 10, ideally 15. But yes, I want to go ahead and make that change regardless. So kind of subtle, but at the top now, we said this baseline phase runs to this point, and there's a little notch on the chart there. And I'm now showing that from that point forward, we're in the test phase, basically. I want to save that change to make sure that that gets saved. And then, yeah, we're now off and running in the test phase. And then similarly, once I've got a load more data and I've finished testing, I can do the same process again, and it would move from test forward into sustain. So yeah, hopefully that answers that. Yeah, we're going to about need to wrap up because we've already gone slightly over. Got a bunch of learning resources that pulled up on the screen here, and so hopefully Sophie can share the links to those in the chat, both from our website, our blog. We've got a number of kind of learning articles that teach you in more detail about SPC and kind of how it works. That cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier that we went through the decision tree, that's up there. Lots of how-to articles on the Help Center, all about how to create the charts, how to create the measures, how to edit them in LiveQI. That's all on the Help Center. And also just our help email address. If you've got any follow-up questions from today, help@liveqisystem.com will come through to a member of our team, and they'll triage and direct that in the right way. And last but not least, I mentioned that this is part of kind of 3 webinars. So if you're interested in finding out more detail about interpreting and evaluating the charts, then sign up to the one next month, 12th of June. The starting a project webinar that I mentioned as well next week, 21st of May at 10:30. So get signed up to that. If you go to liveqsystem.com/webinars, you can sign up to that. If you want to watch back the previous one of the earlier in the series ones, you can go to the YouTube channel or just search for LiveQI on YouTube, and you'll see all of our pre-recorded webinars are up there as well. So yeah, appreciate we've gone a couple of minutes over. There was quite a lot to cover there. That took a little bit longer than I was hoping, but I hope that's been helpful. As I said, feel free to follow up on help@liveqsystem.com by email. Hope that's been helpful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.